investigating the January 6th assault on the Capitol. Her stunning testimony early last year as a former special assistant in the White House who had personally witnessed the goings-on at the highest levels around Donald Trump, provided vivid and damning details about just how far the president and senior aides were willing to go to deny the results of the 2020 election and maintain power. Watching Cassidy testify, the rest of us could only imagine at that time what incredible pressure she had been under not to tell all she knew about what had gone on, and what incredible courage and sense of patriotism it had taken to go public with her story. Well, her book now reveals just what she went through. It starts at the beginning, recounting her childhood in a working-class family in New Jersey, and later her remarkably swift rise in Washington to the upper reaches of Trump's White House, only to become increasingly disillusioned by the chaos, duplicity, and wrongful behavior that she saw. Having once been deeply under Trump's sway, Cassidy eventually faced a choice between continued loyalty to the president and loyalty to the country. Wrenching as that crisis of conscience was for her, her book makes clear that going through it ultimately led her to a stronger sense of herself. In conversation with Cassidy this evening will be a distinguished House Democrat who has led efforts to hold Trump to account, Jamie Raskin. A constitutional law expert, Congressman Raskin has represented So I just wanted to say a couple more lines about Jamie, but obviously you all know who he is. He's a constitutional law expert, and he has represented Maryland's 8th District since 2017, and of course served on the January 6th Select Committee. And he's also authored several books, and his most recent, if you haven't read it, you should. His most recent was Unthinkable, which chronicled his own trauma in early 2021 as he grieved the suicide of his son while leading the second impeachment proceedings against Trump. So I was going to say, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome, but you already have, so on with the show.
Sorry about that. We didn't mean to crash the introduction. We were motioned to go in, and so...
Jamie was just too excited to be here. I, on the other hand.
Well, hello, GW. And thank you, Politics and Prose, for doing this. And thank you, Cassidy, for suggesting me as your interlocutor, your interrogator today.
It wouldn't be the first time.
No.
No, but thank you to Congressman Raskin for agreeing to be here, and also all of you for coming out tonight. This means a tremendous amount to me. I won't speak on behalf of the congressman, but I appreciate you all coming out.
All right, now you've written an extraordinary and riveting, captivating book. I've got 1,000 questions for you. It is a #1 New York Times bestseller, and already they've run out of books. One thing I think that's very cool about the book is that there's no index in it.
I avoided that one intentionally.
Well, my dad used to say that people in Washington read books backwards. They start at the index and they look for their name, then they go to the introduction or the foreword to see if they're there.
See,
and then
ebooks have sort of ruined that a little bit, but hopefully anybody here, they actually have to read it.
Exactly. If you want to know if you're in Cassidy's book, you got to read the book in order to figure it out. Look, I want to salute you on the achievement of doing it. I know how hard it is to write a book, and I know this has been a tough and grueling time for you in a lot of ways. This is a book which, when you finish, you wish a lot more had been said, not a lot less, which is true of most political books. But
first time I think I've heard that in a while.
So I got a lot of questions for you, the personal stuff in this book is as fascinating, or even more fascinating, than the political stuff. And so I want to start with some of the personal stuff. You write that your family did not really talk about politics growing up, and yet you grew fascinated by politics. And in 2012, it was the Romney-Obama race, and that was when you checked out the debate, you investigated a little bit, and you thought that you would become a Republican at that point. You identified. Will you just give us a glimpse into what your thinking was, and like what were the?
I can read the smirk on your face.
Now, what were the ideas and the images that motivated you at that point? I mean, you know, the political scientists say a lot of people are most influenced by their own family in terms of how they end up registering to vote or thinking about politics. But what was it that grabbed you about Romney or the GOP at that point?
You know, I wish there was a very straightforward answer to it. So going back to the way, when I was growing up, my uncle Joe, who was one of the most formative people in my life, he was in the Army. And he was really the only person that I knew. My family is fairly skeptical about the government and didn't have the most fond feelings about the government. So I sort of had that sentiment in my mind. But then I had this man, my Uncle Joe, who did serve in the military. So I had this idea of public service, and I was fascinated by it and sort of wanted to go into public service from a young age myself, although not really knowing what that might look like. So during the 2012 election, we were assigned to watch one of the debates, and I remember watching the first debate and listening to former President Barack Obama and Mitt Romney go back and forth. And it wasn't one particular issue, and I wish it was, but it wasn't one particular issue that stood out to me as much as I liked what Mitt Romney was saying about the party agenda as a whole, and it made sense to me.
Yeah.
At the time, too, I was I think 15 years old.
15, I know. It is hard to keep reminding myself how young you are, but you're exactly the age of our youngest daughter. You're 26 now, right?
Yeah,
and
correct.
I mean, and what's remarkable is when a lot of these events were taking place, when you're 24 or 25, you were by far the youngest person in the White House, and you were also the adult in the room most often. But let's just I've got another question about your childhood, because you describe, I think, in a very delicate way, a childhood that had some chaos and instability in it. And I think it was when your mom decided to move to Indiana. And you went with your brother Jack and your mom. I think your dad had not come out to join you yet for a while, right? But you describe how at recess, the other kids would go out and play, and you stayed in and talked with the teacher. And it seems like your entire life you've had this extraordinary identification with older people who've taken such an interest in you, from Mark Meadows to President Trump to professors, teachers, me, Liz Cheney, Matt Gaetz, although I think that's kind of different.
Let's stick with the credible politicians, please.
So now you can get as psychoanalytical as you want to, or not at all. But I mean, have you noticed that quality in yourself? Have you always felt more comfortable with older people than with your peers. And you've also been intellectually precocious, too. I mean, part of what you describe is being a little bit bored by what was going on with the standard curriculum, wanting to learn from the teachers as much as you could, and looking always for opportunities to study more deeply, specifically government, public policy, politics.
I would say it's two-pronged with that. One, I was raised in an environment where privacy was power. And I think that also sort of carried through my adult life, and that's something there's still a great element to privacy, and that people should always have the right to remain private, but it was different in the way that I was raised in terms of we very much kept to ourselves. I had two
and that
really
came from
good
your
friends.
dad mostly, right?
Yes, predominantly. But then even when my parents got divorced, it was just sort of ingrained in us.
Yeah.
I had two really close friends growing up, but then when they moved, I sort of was like, well, I wanted to be, and I did have other friends my age, but I did feel, so probably to late middle school, I felt really for the first time that I could identify and at least communicate better with adults, which I resented at the time. I also was very tall. I have not grown since 6th grade, so I resented also the fact that I looked like an adult. But no, but then on the other side of it too, I felt more intrigued by adult conversation, not just in the sense of what they were discussing, but I felt that I was more challenging and I could have more thought-provoking conversations with adults, more so than people my own age. That's not completely universal. There have been incredible people in my age group that I've
Well, that leads
privilege
almost
of knowing,
immediately to a question that several people asked. One person wrote, how did someone with your incredible intelligent soul and heart end up with the Trump crew? But before we get to there, I don't want to jump the gun on that.
You're giving me time to think about that answer.
You had a fight with your dad that struck me in the book where he's watching The Apprentice, which was his favorite show. And you said, I wish that you would spend as much time on your family as you spend with Donald Trump and The Apprentice. And that was a remarkable moment. What was your takeaway from the conversation that you had about that? And what did it make you think about Donald Trump?
I was in 4th grade, so I was about 10 years old.
She was 10 years old when The Apprentice was on.
9 or 10. Yeah. I would want to fact check that.
Yeah.
So that was towards the era where my parents were on the verge of getting divorced, or at least progressing towards that. And I want to preface this too. My father, we have a very strained relationship now, and even growing up, but he was very formative in my life, and I wouldn't, for better or for worse, I wouldn't be here today without a lot of the lessons, for better or for worse, that I learned from him.
He taught you to be a warrior.
Yes, and up to the readers, whatever you want to make of that.
Yeah.
But no, he's a very complicated man, but I love him, and he loved me the way that he knew how to love me. And with The Apprentice, I had this very faint idea of who Donald Trump was. I grew up in New Jersey, so I feel like a lot of people sort of had an idea of who Donald Trump was. But my father owned his own business. He owned a landscaping company. And a tree
not
service
Four
company.
Seasons landscaping.
Not Four Seasons, no. That's another unbelievable thing. My father was always looking for the next best business venture. And he put Donald Trump on this pedestal as this man who built this empire, which now I look back and more recently in the last year, totally not the correct perception. But I didn't really grow up personally idolizing Trump, but I grew up around people who either idolized Trump as the businessman or idolized the mentality behind that and behind what he had said. So when he was running for president, one, I didn't really take it seriously at first, but two, it wasn't this, I didn't have this four-dimensional view of what an actual Trump presidency could look like based off of my 4th grade apprentice experience.
and that was your first encounter with Donald Trump, when your dad was watching him on The Apprentice.
It was. Yeah. Now, I remember also when I was like middle school, high school, we would go down to Atlantic City sometimes, and what was the Trump Hotel, or one of the Trump casinos, like my stepfather, he's my chosen father, I call him in the book, Paul, would talk about Donald Trump too. So he was sort of a household name, but not where I was like pushed to adore him myself. So I feel like it was sort of this, almost a sense of premonition. Like there's this man that I sort of know who he is, and that's being touted as this incredible businessman and this American giant. And then, I land in the East Wing the first time.
Well, when they make the movie of your book, he will appear as a cameo in those first scenes in the background.
I'm sure he'll be thrilled.
But why was your mom the essential person in your family, as you put it?
After my parents got divorced, a lot of times I felt like it was my mom and I against the world, and they had a complicated divorce. And I did choose, writing this book was difficult because you mentioned psychoanalysis earlier. I'm not very big on psychoanalysis, so for me, like my life was my life, and it was sort of like a survival mode, which I didn't fully appreciate or realize at the time. But we got by day, and they had a very strained relationship, but I sort of took the role as the intermediary. And she worked, but she had a very low-paying job. She relied on him financially, so we were trying to keep that relationship there. So her and I in those years, so now I'm in 5th grade, so I'm 11, but in those years after, through high school graduation, relied on each other a lot as emotional support, but also as support for our family, just to make sure that we could get by.
Yeah. You made a trip to Washington, D.C., and felt this immediate, intense affinity with the city in a kind of ethical sense and a spiritual sense, and you knew that it would be an important part of your destiny. What was it you saw in Washington when you came here? How old were you during that trip?
2nd grade.
Yeah.
So it was after my 2nd grade going to 3rd grade. So my uncle,
she has an amazing memory, and she doesn't forget anything, which makes her a badass witness on Capitol Hill. So
You're welcome. So my Uncle Joe and my Aunt Steph had just moved from Indiana to Washington, D.C. He had come back from Afghanistan. They had moved. He was working at the Pentagon. We arrived late in the night, and they had an apartment in Crystal City, and their balcony overlooked the skyline. And I remember the next morning waking up and looking out and just feeling mesmerized with the city skyline. And I hadn't even gone into the city yet. Later that day, we went and did a walk on the mall, like the Washington Mall, starting at the Lincoln Memorial and ending at the Capitol. And the first time I felt this, like what I call now like a gravitational pull, was when I saw the Washington Monument. And I don't know why, but it's forever been this.
You might need psychoanalysis for that one.
Oh, Jamie. I feel like we need another person here. No, but so we passed the Washington Monument, we got to the Capitol, and I actually have a picture of this. It's quite embarrassing. But I started crying, and I looked at my mom, and I said I wanted to stay. We moved around a lot when I was a child. And I was like, can we move to Washington, D.C.? I really want to move to Washington, D.C., but I remember we were at the Capitol. I was looking at the Capitol, and I feel like it was that moment that it kind of clicked for me, where I had this idea of public service. I had been to a city. I had no idea, I'm, again, very young, but no idea what it would look like, but I felt that I belonged here. And every time I would visit D.C. and then leave, it would be a very emotional experience for me. So I sort of lived with this goal of, like, how can I get back?
You were the first person in your family to go to college.
I was.
And you went to Christopher Newport in Virginia, not far from D.C. Tell us about how you actually got involved in Republican politics and government service. Because one of the remarkable things about the book is how many of the people who are key actors in the drama of January 6th and the insurrection and the attempted coup were people you had actually met before or you knew before, including...
Most formative years in my very young career in D.C.
Yeah, Jim Jordan was somebody, Kevin McCarthy, you met Nancy Pelosi, you had a story about her and so on. So how did you get involved, and how did you make like that rapid ascent into politics such that you actually knew a lot of these players, including Liz Cheney?
Yeah. So after my sophomore year, or during my sophomore year of college, I had worked my freshman summer going into sophomore year, worked through sophomore year, but I worked the summer after freshman year because I had the goal, okay, I need to spend the next few summers interning so I can eventually get a job in Washington.
The college kids are taking notes, by the way, on what you're saying here. So, yeah.
For better or for worse, take what I say with a grain of salt. But I remember it was right after winter break sophomore year, I went to the library and locked myself in one of the study rooms, and I filled out an application for every single House Republican office and sent them out. No idea what I was doing. I just was like, our next year, Maine, perfect. I'm going to apply for your office. I got several interviews, including one in leadership with the then Majority Whip, Steve Scalise, and was offered to, I ended up taking the internship with Majority Whip Steve Scalise then, so this is summer of 2017. And when I started working there, I started working with the member services team, which is, not to delve too deep into it, but the member services team is in charge of managing the relationships with all of House Republicans. So as the intern, I got to know the majority of the Republican conference that summer. And I think that sort of set me up for the future opportunities, including the next summer when I interned in the Office of Legislative Affairs at the White House.
Right, and that was who hired you that first time when you went to the White House?
Mark Short was the director of Legislative Affairs at the time.
Yeah, and he also comes to play a role in January 6th.
So Mark Short was the director of Legislative Affairs when I interned in Legislative Affairs. And then when I was hired full-time in the summer of 2019, Mark Short became the Vice President's Chief of Staff and was there until the end.
All right, so let's come back to that question that my friend asked you with the note card, which is, how did someone like you, who comes through both in person and in this book you've written as honest and decent and loyal and very law-abiding, come to basically do anything that was asked of you by a president who is, now I'm speaking, this is an editorial here on my part, totally disloyal, totally dishonest, totally deceptive, duplicitous, untrustworthy, and so on. So, how does that happen? That's a remarkable story, and it's an important story for us to understand in democracy.
Okay, I'm not trying to read the book, everybody, but I'll preface it with two.
Well, I read the book. I'm still asking the question, and I love the book.
I guess everyone here already has it. I want to briefly talk about one moment. So I did vote for Donald Trump in 2016. Didn't put all that much thought into it. I didn't think that he had a chance of winning, and I was dating somebody at the time who was a Republican, did not like Donald Trump. For better, but it wasn't that big of a strife at the time. I was not fully what I call like Team Trump or like a believer in the agenda, really. But so I went to the Trump's 100th day rally in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, at the end of April, and it wasn't so much the policy that had attracted me. And again, I try to be very candid and vulnerable in the book and admit my flaws where I have them, and there's a lot of them. But it wasn't so much about the policy at the time. It was, I was at this rally. I had heard about this effect that it has on you when you go to a rally and you just feel pulled to him. But then, so I'm standing there and I'm looking around and I'm looking at all of these people who, one, are mesmerized by him, and to borrow a Trump line, a lot of them had tears in their eyes. But looking at this man, and but they're all people that I felt like I grew up around. And my parents voted for the first time in 2016 for Trump. So I'm looking around, I'm like, maybe he is the politician that can change things. Maybe he is that person that everyone is saying that he is. But at that time, my goal was not to work for Donald Trump. I did want to work in legislative affairs. I interned in legislative affairs. At the end of that internship, my goal was to get back to Capitol Hill. I was offered a job at the White House after I graduated, and regardless of our politics here, and I told the story in a way where I tried to tell it in real time, where I felt like how my mind was working at the time versus how I came to be where I'm at now. But when I took the job, a full-time job in legislative affairs, it was an honor to serve in the executive branch. And I realize that might not be the most flattering answer, but I was honored, and I think that anybody who has the opportunity to serve in government, whether it's the legislative branch, wherever it is, you should take it. I mean, it's an invaluable experience, and I wasn't a partisan slinger though for a lot of.
Yeah.
There was a very slow progression to the point where I was the public servant, and then I was the loyal foot soldier.
Gotcha. And so that was kind of the trajectory you're on, because there's so much patriotism in this book, like when you see the flag, when you see Washington, when you see the monuments. And so you were carried away with the idea of just being in government and just being able to serve in the executive branch, right? But did you ever have any misgivings or second thoughts about anything going on when you were at the White House before January 6th? Like, for example,
Yes.
there was a moment when when Amy Coney Barrett was being nominated to the Supreme Court, and was there ever any discussion about the fact that McConnell and the GOP had blocked my constituent, Merrick Garland, from even getting a hearing 11 months before the end of Obama's term, and then 2 months before the end of Trump's term, they railroaded through Mrs. Waterford or whatever her name is. They got it through like that. But was there any? Did that give you pause? Did anything like that give you pause?
There were. It's a broad question. There were a lot of moments that did give me pause, and I want to be delicate with the way I answer this. Yes, I worked in legislative affairs. I was promoted to work in the Chief of Staff's office because I had developed a relationship with then Congressman Mark Meadows. But when I took the job with Mark, I was very clear with him that I was working for the office of the Chief of Staff, not Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, because I saw myself as working for the institution, not the individual. And that was a clear and distinct difference to me. At the time, I wasn't fully aware. There is this very strong sense of loyalty in the Trump administration, and I saw myself as loyal to the government and to the office and to the job I had. At some point, those lines became blurred, and at some point, it was very, very blurred. So that being said, there were things that gave me pause, especially like during the coronavirus pandemic, and when we would go to the Hill to meet with leadership, Speaker Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. But the way I saw my job was I had a job to do, and whatever I had to do to get that job done. Like, I wasn't there negotiating policy. I was there trying to provide counsel to the principals that were tasked with it. And the way that I saw my job was the better job I do and the more sound counsel I can provide them with, the better this will go as a whole, if that sort of answers the question. And
you talk about COVID a lot, about the mixed messages that were being sent and the strange signals. And
the disinfectant getting injected, yeah.
Yeah.
That was an interesting day.
And then you all ended up getting it, of course. You got it after Trump got it, right?
There's no good time to get coronavirus, let me be clear.
Yeah.
But at that moment, I caught coronavirus right after November 3rd. So we had just finished the campaign.
Loyal to a fault.
I came. So I had a nice 10-day little recess while all the election stuff is starting to go underway. So I get back, and then I'm in the middle of what the heck is going on.
Well, so let's talk about that. What were the warning signs for you pre-January 6th about what was going on? I mean, you record there were a number of closed-door meetings that you were closed out of. But did you have an inkling that there were these various streams of coup and insurrection that were leading up to an explosion on January 6th?
At the time, and at first, so at the time, so I'm talking about mid-November 2020 through mid-December 2020. At the time, no. Because at that point, in my mind, we were filing lawsuits, and just for the record too, I think any candidate that thinks that the election results are close enough does have the right to file lawsuits where...
That's the right way to do it.
It's accepting
Yeah.
what the lawsuits say. And when
Yeah.
you're starting to defy the rule of laws, when it starts to get a little fickle. But so at first and also Mr. Trump before the election had talked to me sarcastically on Air Force one day, but saying like, if the Democrats steal this election from us, will you move down to Florida with me? So I had no idea how far it was going to go.
Yeah.
December 18th,
and there were lots of indications, and I think you helped to tip us off to some of these, where Trump was saying things like, walking around and just harumphing, I can't believe I lost to this guy, that there was a kind of deep personal recognition.
We would get to a point where then he would just concede and be defiant about it, but no idea that it would get to the point that it did. I would say, though, December 18th, 2020 was probably the first real turning. And again, at the time, I look back now and I see how things lined up, and a lot went over my mind. But December 18th was the night that there was an Oval Office meeting with I'm just going to say Mike Flynn. Mike Flynn, the former Overstock.com CEO, Patrick Byrne, Sidney Powell, and they were discussing invoking martial law or the Insurrection Act. And that was the first moment for me. And the days afterwards just kept getting more astounding. But again, we were still dealing with a lot of issues that weren't just January 6th related. Like, we were still working to pass the NDAA. Some people were trying to work on the peaceful transfer. So it wasn't like my days weren't only consumed with January 6th things, but December 18th, I think, was the turning point where it was like, okay, things are kind of getting a little...
Yeah. So your mom, who is a hero of mine in this book anyway, called you and said, don't go to work on January 6th.
Yeah. Fairly far. So it was December 19th, the tweet was sent out that Be There Will Be Wild on January 6th. And candidly, I have some family members who are would associate themselves with some of the more extreme what I call the more extreme right-wing groups, such as QAnon. It was early January. My mom had probably from speaking with my family, we've never had a very in-depth conversation about it, but she knew that a lot of people were coming to DC for this rally. I knew we were having a rally, but to me it was, okay, it's a rally. We also had one in Georgia on January 4th. But she was really nervous about the rally beforehand. And up until the night before and morning of, she tried to convince me not to go to work. But for me, like, I had a job to do, and I had to go.
Yeah. Well, and
so she may be thankful I did. I don't know.
I mean, one of the dramatic moments in your testimony before the Select Committee on January 6th is when you described Trump's reaction to the Secret Service's insistence that people coming to his rally, which was kind of the warm-up rally for the march and the big scene at the Capitol, their determination that people have to go through the MAGs. Now tell us that story, if you would, from your perspective about what exactly happened, because I think that was a moment that was electrifying before.
Electrifying for me that morning too.
Yeah.
That was like the first moment I had that morning. I was like, holy crap, what the hell is happening today?
So explain that. And you actually talk about the MAGs a lot in the election period leading up to it, and how important...
The MAGs were always an issue during the campaign. And they were sort of the bane of my existence at the time.
Well, and that's short for magnetometers.
Correct. And thank you all. I think you all had to go through magnetometers, or at least get some... Thank you all. I know you're all here for us, but I appreciate the fact that you were willing to do it.
They came in to tell us that we were going to be starting late because people were going through the magnetometers, and I heard Cassie say, "Tell them to take down the effing mag." So, yeah.
It was a joke. It was a private moment.
Sorry.
On that, the day I had to go up and testify, we were in the car going to the Capitol, and I said to my lawyers, I'm like, I'm the effing witness. Take me back to Alston and Burn now. So we tried to bring some humor to it. No, so I got to the dark humor, very serious topics, especially today as we're approaching this next election cycle, which has came like that. No, so I got to the White House that morning, and we're driving through all these crowds of Trump supporters. This is sort of weird. So I go into the Deputy Chief of Staff's office, who receives security updates, and he starts reading me emails that he had been receiving about what the Secret Service deemed as weapons, and some of which are very clearly weapons, but things like flagpoles, which maybe not weapons, but like spears to the end of flagpoles, that's a problem. Secret Service had seen guns on people. So then when we get down to the ellipse that day, I mentioned that the magnetometers were always an issue during the campaigns because the president, or Mr. Trump, always wanted the rally space to be full for a picture. It wasn't that day because all the people who were trying to get through the mags had, quote unquote, Secret Service deemed weapons that they couldn't get through the magnetometers. So the former president had said, take the effing mags down. They're not here to hurt me. Take the effing mags away. They can march to the Capitol from here. Thankfully, the men and women of the Secret Service knew that regardless if they were there for him or not, the magnetometers had to stay up.
Yeah.
Sorry,
so,
Jamie.
well, take us just a little bit into your mind about what was taking place over the course of the day. You were presumably watching on TV what was taking place at the Capitol. Mm-hmm. You saw the vice president flee. You saw the House and the Senate evacuate the chambers.
A lot of it hearing, too. Yeah, sometimes I have trouble deciphering because just what was actually televised at the time, because some things were televised later in the day. This day, I mean, it will never be, I don't know, it makes me emotional to think about because I felt so helpless that day because I have such a connection with the institution of Congress, and I knew so many of you, so many staffers, but also like seeing, I described it in the testimony, and it's the best way I can think of to describe it now even, but it was sort of like watching a bad car accident or being in a bad car accident where it starts to happen, there's nothing you can do to stop it. And
you saw the officers being beaten and bloodied and...
some things were on Twitter, again, but being back at the White House, it was just sort of just, we were at the ellipse, we knew that the security barricades, the bike racks were starting to be breached. We knew that the Capitol Police were overrun with the rioters. And the president still wanted to go to the Capitol. We get back to the White House despite his resistance. And so I'm sitting at my desk and I'm sort of back and forth. But every minute of that day felt like a lifetime because we're just sort of like waiting for the next bad thing to happen. And once they actually got through, I mean, that's when I think how real it was hit me, although I sort of saw it going in that direction for a while, but my mind immediately went to, I don't want to fearmonger with it, but my mind immediately went to like, these people don't know who, these people meaning the rioters, don't know who most of these members of Congress are. They don't know who journalists are. They think that journalists are the enemy of the people. To me, at the time, I was they would have had no bounds, and like if they had gotten, I was fearful. Members of Congress, but anybody, like they.
Well, they were chanting "Hang Mike Pence,"
yeah,
and they knew exactly who he was.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they know who Speaker Pelosi was, and even if they, I think maybe Jim Jordan would have been spared. I think they probably could have recognized Jim Jordan, but if you had your pin on, like it was frightening being on the inside, knowing bits and pieces of what was happening at the Capitol. And also knowing that there wasn't much that I could do to stop it? And it was a very helpless feeling, and like it's something that will always live with me. Yeah, so I don't want to, I'm sure you have a follow-up, but.
Lawyers play a prominent role in your story here. You were in desperate search of a lawyer. You had little or no money. You don't come from a family with a lot of wealth, and your savings were meager. And you could have given everything you had for a day's worth of legal services in Washington. And so you were looking around for a lawyer who would do it for pro bono or
at
low
least be
discount.
able to put me on a payment plan.
Like a pay-away plan. You did not want to end up being, a bought and paid for witness under the Trump employ, and yet you ended up with a Trump lawyer. And that's a chapter that I recommend highly to people in law schools to read about what it's really like to need a lawyer.
And I'll leave it to the lawyers to draw the conclusions. I'm sure that
right.
But,
well, so you ended up with some great lawyers here.
One of which is here, Mr. Bill Jordan.
Bill Jordan is here in his right place.
And Stephen Simrel and Alicia Badley.
But that's the favorable denouement of the whole story. It started out bad because you did end up going with a lawyer who was clearly from Trump world. Mm-hmm. I think I maybe even went to school with this lawyer, Stefan Passantino, right? Is that?
That's
and you were told to limit your testimony to as few words as possible. And if you couldn't remember every single detail of an episode, to say you couldn't recall anything about the episode, right? So you got some instructions that were, well, borderline. That's a problem for them to deal with, I guess. But how did you experience that as somebody being called to testify?
To backpedal slightly on that. And candidly, after January 6th, I was very outspoken in the final days of the administration that the administration was completely at fault for what happened that day. My mind
outspoken where? In the White House?
Yes, in the White House.
Yeah.
Like, it was not a secret how my contempt for the fact that we were complicit and we were the only reason that day happened. But
you know what?
Still,
I think we should clap for that. I think,
thank you, but it's sad that we sort of have to. Thank you.
It's Washington. You get a standing ovation for telling the truth. So
we shouldn't. That's a big part of the reason I decided to write the book, because we're in this, in my opinion, in this crisis of accountability, and we need to elect leaders to office and hire people in positions of public service who shouldn't need to be clapped for telling the truth. It comes with the job. It comes with swearing the oath. All that being said, I just want to point this out to you because I don't want to try to play revisionist history. I was still planning to move down to Mar-a-Lago with the former president, and at the time I felt that he needed good people surrounding him, and I felt that I could be a sound voice. That fell through. He kept me on payroll mysteriously. Generosity is not his strong suit, so that's a quite big question mark. But he kept me on payroll for several months. I took that period to sort of decompress and sort of saw how things were unraveling on Capitol Hill, knowing full well that if I were called to testify under subpoena or voluntarily, I wanted to be forthcoming with the committee, whatever committee had been formed. So when I actually was subpoenaed to testify, I started this mad search for an attorney because in my mind, I had been in Trump world, which was an advantage and disadvantage, but I know that accepting something like an attorney from Trump world at that juncture, I had worked for, at that point, 10 months to sort of separate myself very slowly from the world so there wasn't a target on my back. So I wouldn't appear disloyal, but accepting something like that is a form of currency. You owe more than just what they expect you to say. All that being said, I was served. I did have the Trump-appointed counsel, and I did receive counsel from that attorney. But I also accepted it, and I accept responsibility for that. But I also think thematically, when we look at the cases as they're unraveling now, I think of several of my former colleagues, and if they weren't my former colleagues, several people who are reported to and that I know have Trump-appointed counsel, and it's sort of there's a bigger issue here. And I was very fortunate to be able to find my incredible legal counsel, who I really credit, I don't say this lightly, but like with saving my life. Maybe not in like an actual life or death way, but saving my life and steering me back to the right side of history.
Yeah.
But without
and these
that,
lawyers from Alston Bird are 100%
yes.
pro bono.
I 100% pro bono. And besides that too, I mean, they offered me and gave me the sense of community and belonging and acceptance that I hadn't known for so long. And I felt like, and still to this day, sometimes feel like I don't deserve. So I have been very fortunate to be able to tell my story from the other side now.
Yeah.
It's not without people like you and Liz Cheney and the committee and also my attorneys that gave me that second chance.
I just have a couple more questions for you, then I'm going to ask a few more from the audience, because believe it or not, I think we might be running out of time. What was your experience like as a witness on that day? Sometimes people describe to me being a witness like watching themselves from the outside, like they feel a little bit dissociated by it. They feel like it's really happening to someone else. But what was your experience of the day, where I should say you acquitted yourself remarkably well, and everybody across the board was totally convinced of your candor and your honesty, I think you changed millions of people's minds that day. So.
Thank you, guys. Well, for starters, when I switched legal counsel, I was very clear that I did not want to testify live. And not at all. I was like, I will go back. I want to be completely forthcoming. The committee was very generous. They gave us my transcripts. We went through line by line. We corrected, we added a lot of filler where I knew more than what I had led on to be. We even went through and did spelling corrections. Very, very thorough, going back through my old transcripts. Still didn't want to testify live. I was like, this is going to be useful for them. They'll be able to use this information to get other witnesses. When I learned that I would be a live witness, it was like the fear of God was struck into me. I was like, no, don't want to give up my privacy and my identity. But I did come around to it slowly, and even up until the last minute, Bill had to physically push me out, very gently, but push me out of the hold room. I had made peace with it, and I recognized several elements. There was an importance to having somebody who had been there, who was willing to speak truths to the egregious acts that occurred that day, not just on January 6th, but afterwards too. But it also was important for women and little girls to see that we're living in this society where, unfortunately, men, many years my senior, are either avoiding subpoenas or were at the time pleading the fifth and just avoiding all forms of accountability. And not to get on a feminist angle here, but we need more women in government for that reason too. But sitting at the witness table, I was very afraid, very cognizant that every move I made could and would be scrutinized. But I also had this overwhelming sense of peace, because I knew that I was doing the right thing, and I was sitting in front of a dais of people who, in my opinion, are some of the most moral and ethical politicians, but human beings that are in Washington in this era. So let's clap for Mr. Raskin.
Well, you're a great witness, as I said, and I was thinking when you testified about Mark Twain, who said, if you always tell the truth, you never have anything to remember, some of the people we talked to always had to remember what they said the last time, and so on. And you came in with the conviction of truth. And I think that communicated really well. Well, we need to talk a little bit about the future and your future, Cassidy Hutchinson. Everybody wants to know what you're going to do.
Me too.
So, could you see yourself actually going into politics? And is there a political party that fits you anymore? So.
You're tricky. To answer your first question, I right now do not see, you say go into politics. I still believe that what I am doing right now is tangential to politics.
It's actually integral to politics right
okay.
now.
I just wanted to make sure, I'm just making the separation between, like, I'm not running to have a job on Capitol Hill right now. I think it's probably not the time for me. I need a little bit of a break.
These people are asking, would you ever run for office yourself? And become
yeah, you just changed the tenor of the question.
Yeah.
I would not say no, because I had said no to a lot of things in my past, including testifying live, and look where I am. Honestly, I don't have the ability to have that sort of hindsight right now. I think what I'm focused on right now is sharing the message in this book, which to me is much greater than Donald Trump. You know, Donald Trump is an element to the book, but it's, I like to say, if Donald Trump fell off the face of the earth tomorrow, there still would be a problem that exists, and it still is poisoning our political systems. And I am a firm believer that we need a healthy Republican Party and a healthy Democratic Party, and I hope that there is a day that we could sit here and have a very well thought out debate as a Republican.
Yeah.
Never, I don't know, up for discussion on JV's view. So I guess I think it's, like, I sort of wish sometimes I was jaded enough to say, no, I'm going to go move somewhere else and live but what we are facing right now is dangerous, and it's, in my opinion, one of the most grave threats our democracy has faced in my lifetime, perhaps in recent American history. And it doesn't just require us and Congress to pay attention to that. You know, I hope with this book and with the platform that I have now, I can help open people's eyes, and I hope that people will listen, because it's important for more ways than just determining the outcome of the next presidential election. Like, we're quite literally fighting for the future of our country and our republic.
And democracy on earth.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. And we're an experiment. We're not guaranteed. Nothing here is guaranteed.
No. Well, why is your book called Enough?
I was worried you were going to ask me this question.
It's a very subtle question.
But there's a very nuanced, there are many nuanced answers. Short answer with that, I touched on it briefly earlier. I tried to write the book as I experienced my life and how I got to this point. I try not to assign adjectives to people, places, things, or events. I try to just tell things like how I experienced them and was mentally processing things at the time. You know, the straightforward answer with enough is I reached a point where enough was enough. It wasn't just enough was enough with my former Trump World Counsel. I reached a point where enough was enough of not being who I was, not fulfilling the public servant in myself, who I saw myself coming to DC and becoming. And I had had enough of this era of just living this lie, and I couldn't do it anymore. But you know, there are more nuanced meanings to it, and I would love to leave it up to the reader to interpret some of those. But you know, I also think one other thing on that, Jamie. Sorry to interject another question. You know, I also want people to know that their voice alone is enough, and it doesn't require a mass to come out and say enough, or say whatever you may say to stick up for yourself. And I would love to give a shout out to Liz Cheney, who, you know, I have my incredible team of attorneys, but Liz Cheney was really the first person that an extremely courageous individual who has the heart of a founding father, and just her love for our country is something I think that we all should look towards, as well as Congressman Raskin. But it was Liz who really reminded me that it's like, I am enough, and I am enough to not only speak truth to power, but to hopefully create change, because we can't keep surviving as a nation.
That's
as
beautiful.
We are.
Some people want to know about the Watergate figures you identify with, and I know you made a very special friend in this process.
Mr. Butterfield. Yes, Alex. So the committee had very generously published pages of my transcripts where I had a little bit of a mental breakdown one evening. And I was able to read in real time that how far gone I was. And I had wanted to get back to the right side of history. And I was thinking about Watergate, like there had to be somebody, I knew who John Dean was, but I was thinking like there had to be somebody else who had a similar role to me, who didn't play this big consequential role in the hearings.
Who wasn't a lawyer.
Wasn't a lawyer.
Yeah.
So I started Googling those who had testified. Came across Alex Butterfield, who we had nearly identical titles, and he worked in the office of the chief of staff. He hadn't written a book, so I was like, perfect. He testified, he left, he didn't try to make a name for himself. Now my face is on the cover of a book, so. But he did work on this book with Bob Woodward. So I ordered several copies of it. You could see, it's tabbed. I wish we could pass it around, although it's a little embarrassing. But he really was the man, and it seems now looking back, which should have seemed so obvious, but I didn't really have anybody I was in a very dark period of my life, and just this period of almost complete isolation. The people who I wasn't isolated from were my former friends in Trump world, who I wasn't being my authentic self with. So when I read this book that Alex had worked on with Bob Woodward, Alex became my friend in these pages, and I felt I could relate to him and his journey, but also like who he was, and he inspired me to then, start to try to correct course and try to find a second chance.
Yeah.
So, there are many people in this journey who I pay tribute to, but Alex is one that, and he just another incredible American. But it's unfortunate that 50 years after Watergate, we're in a position where we're dealing with the results of another corrupt presidency.
Yeah. One person asks an interesting question, which is, how do you have the poise and maturity to handle your job and your testimony? Because you had not left at that point.
Meaning?
Trump world, or...
During the testimony? Well, during the testimony, I was pretty much cut off.
Oh, you were, so. But weren't they still entertaining kind of the delusion that you might watch your words at that point?
I don't know. I would leave that question to them. But from my perspective, I think the moment that I had retained new counsel, they probably had a fairly good idea. Not that I would testify live, but that I was willing to be more forthcoming.
Yeah.
I'd also back-channeled for a third interview without my former attorney's knowledge at the time.
Right.
With one of my good friends, Alyssa Farrah Griffin, who had been outspoken about January 6th from January 7th forward. So it wasn't probably some big secret, although I think that until I switched attorneys, they probably expected me to remain loyal.
It's an interesting story about Washington, how much government really does depend on bright young people who come in and really do the work.
Yeah.
And
not to belittle, but I'm sure you have an incredible staff, and maybe not as young as I was.
Yeah.
But
younger even.
Members of Congress run, and everybody, they rely on staffers. And it's also important to be able to provide an environment to those staffers where they want to aspire to be politicians and to lead by example.
But I mean, it's an incredible object lesson in how it was you, in that case, it was the young staffers who were the ones who were insisting upon a loyalty to the truth and ethical principle. And we might never have known the truth were it not for you and other people in a similar situation, because the jadedness, as you put it, and the conspiracy of lies was so fierce at the top levels and continues to this day. And there's still people who believe the big lie, although it's been completely debunked.
Right,
Just in case.
and I think that there are people who still believe the big lie, and those minds will never change. You know, I think with me coming forward, that was something that I had to accept. Like there are immovable people, but there are people who either might believe what he's saying, or they might believe that they might believe Donald Trump is better than Joe Biden. So with the platform I have now, like all I ask is for people to listen to me and to listen to people like me, because it's the people who are on the inside. And you know, I think slowly we're seeing people start to break away and speak the truth. But to listen to people like us who weren't never Trumpers, who Donald Trump would not have considered what he calls rhinos, but also see the grave dangers of what we endured at the end and what continues to endure today. I mean, look no further than Truth Social, but in the way that some of these cases are playing out, I mean, the Department of Justice has brought the largest case in American history against the former president of the United States, and that's a really sad place for us to be in. But I hope that people listen, because in this next year, it's all of our responsibilities to speak the truth and to speak to people in a way where they feel welcomed to have those conversations. Because I know in my position for a while, I did want to split away from Trump world. I saw how egregious and terrible the things that we had done were, but I also was sort of, I say this with shame, but scared to leave, because I felt, okay, if I do leave, I'm going to be questioned and ridiculed, and people are always going to question my intentions, which I think to a degree is fine, and I welcome that. But we can't shame people out of coming forward.
That's right. That's right. Well, that's a beautiful way for us to end this. I want to thank you for your moral courage in speaking so candidly and openly about your entire life and your experience and your family and your work and your education. I want to thank you for your love of our beautiful country, and thank you for your patriotism, Cassidy. And I want to thank you for your willingness to keep growing and keep learning. And remember, there's always a home for you in the Democratic Party. Thank you, Politics and Prose. Thank you, GW. Thank you, Cassidy Hutchinson. Check out her book.
And Mr. Raskin has another phenomenal book, too.
All right. Well done. Well done, Cass.